They were the most popular feature we ever had in the magazine. And I think the circulation, well, it didn't quite double when we started, but it was, and it's often the case with magazines and newspapers. If you have one particular feature or even a strip cartoon or something like that, it can make the entire difference to the sales. And it certainly happened with that. The circulation rocketed up. And luckily, your mother was in charge for quite a long time, so it went on for about 10 years. Well, the one I do remember, and I think we reprinted it in the Eye when John died, which was very sad, was when they visited the Falklands after the war. And Denis had been hoping that he wouldn't have to go, but he was told at the last minute, this is made up, that he had to accompany the boss, as he called her. And he endured this frightful aeroplane journey which went on for hours, and there were no drinks on board or anything like that. And then they landed and they were greeted by this Governor Hunt, and he had an awful time being taken for tea, and he was desperate to get to the pub, this place called the Upland, what was it called, the Upland Goose or something. And then he got there eventually and was full of hacks all boozing away and everything. And that was I think my favourite one. It was like meeting someone one knew already. He was absolutely right, but he was always incredibly nice to me. I was always, because when I met him, I was slightly on my guard because I thought he might not like having to talk to someone like myself who'd actually been taking the mickey for several years. But he was always incredibly nice, and he's been to a lot of our literary lunches since. Not invited by us. I mean, he comes off his own bat. And he's invariably charming and very polite, and everybody loves him.
Mr. Thatcher was very good at attempting to get the Prime Minister to have some rest and a bit of fresh air, and this was generally down at Chequers, where he sort of insisted that she did have some rest on the weekend after a frantic week at Number 10, and he used to take her around the rose garden. He used to lock a few balls on the lawn, and she used to go out with him. And also, if there was just the two of them on a Saturday night, he used to insist that they watch the television. And I know that he particularly insisted that she watched Miss Marple, which they both enjoyed. And Mr. Thatcher always said one of the great treats of going to Chequers was that the Radio Times was open at the page of that day. But also, as you know, Mr. Thatcher likes a bit of music, and he used to play some music down there for they used to read, and that was a great input from him, because she was not a very relaxed person otherwise. Travels were always a bit frantic. We had an experience in Kenya where a guest house for Mr. Thatcher, Prime Minister, myself, and one or two other staff, we were going to stay. When we arrived in Nairobi, the Prime Minister went off to see some government officials. Mr. Thatcher and I went on to the guest house. I was unpacking, Mr. Thatcher was unpacking, and he suddenly comes and he shouts, "Crawford, there's no hot water." I said, "Don't worry, I'll go and see the housekeeper." So off I go to see the housekeeper, who confirms that the guest house has not been used for 8 years and the boiler is blown up. But they have some dustbins, new dustbins, I hasten to add, on the stove, which are warming up for the Prime Minister to have a bath. So I go back, report to Mr. Thatcher. Then, 10 minutes later, he comes, "Crawford, the lights have all gone out. There's no lights." I said, "Well, don't worry, we'll have to improvise." So I go off again to see the housekeeper. She said the electrician's on his way. So I go back upstairs and report, and then within 15 minutes, I hear Mr. Thatcher shouting, "Crawford, never mind the hot water, never mind the lights. The ceiling has just fallen on the Prime Minister's bed." I said, "I don't think I can improvise that, Mr. Thatcher." He said, "Well, we'll have to get it cleaned up." Fine. He said, "She's got to have a good night's rest." And so we had to improvise. And as a little anecdote to that, I think it would be interesting for people to know that Bernard Ingham and Charles Powell carried up the dustbins of hot water for the Prime Minister to have a bath.
Well, I remember one Christmas Day at Chequers, you were there, and we got there at 12:30, as we always did, and the family arrived from church late. And Denis was Denis, very courteous man, Denis, and he was very embarrassed about being late, and we'd all been standing around for half an hour waiting for the family. And we came in, and Margaret apologised, and Carol and Mark came in and apologised, and Denis came in last, and he looked at us all and he said, well, there's one vicar that doesn't want to be a bishop, alluding to the fact that the sermon had gone on too long. First of all, he was obviously fantastically in love with his wife, as she was with him, which makes a huge difference if you've got that kind of emotional comfort. It enables you to face all sorts of crises. He would never take things as seriously as people wanted him to, and I think humour diffuses all sorts of difficulties. Fiercely loyal. If Margaret was cross with somebody, Denis never argued with her about her being cross. He supported her in being cross, and they would go through conversations where she would say so and so is absolutely ghastly, and he'd say you're absolutely right, he's absolutely ghastly, and they'd go on through until Margaret then decided he wasn't ghastly, and the only sort of awkward moments would be when Denis hadn't quite caught up with how her mood was changing. But he was fantastically supportive. I think probably whenever she had really difficult days, as she did from time to time, the one thing she was certain of is that when she went home or up to the flat in Downing Street, that there would be Denis who would be a rock. The journalists liked him. They liked the way he behaved. He has no vanity. He never sought publicity. He never sought a high profile. He sought no credit from the enormous achievements that Margaret made. And he actually sought no favour from anybody about it at all. And I think the press admired him. I mean, he is a genuinely modest but very fine human being, and I think the press saw that. He wouldn't talk to the press because he didn't think it was anything to do with him. He was there by accident. He was there because he was Margaret's husband, not because he'd been elected by anybody. And I think because he had a great philosophy about the press, which was if you don't like what they write, don't read the bloody things. I think about the only time I can remember Denis breaking ranks from being, if you like, 100% supportive of the point of view that Margaret had, was when, around about the 10th anniversary, we were all discussing the fact that it was probably time for her to retire now because she was absolutely at the top of the tree. It was the perfect moment to go because you would be remembered forever at your peak of your powers rather than in decline. Denis, as you know, a huge rugby fan, was rather impressed by Barry John, who did exactly the same thing when he was absolutely the superstar fly half. He just retired at the peak of his career. And I remember we were at supper at Chequers, and Gordon Rees was there, and Denis and myself and Margaret. Margaret had gone off to do some boxes or something or other, and the three of us were nattering. And he turned to Gordon and he said, "Gordon, Margaret's at the peak of her powers, 10 years, done long enough. I think countries have had their value. I think it's time for her to go. And I think, Gordon, as you are her best friend, you should tell her." To which Gordon, who was much the worse for champagne, said, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly do that, Denis, because I love her." And Denis said, "Steady, Gordon, she's my wife." I think he was probably the greatest consort that a political leader has had anywhere in the world. I don't suppose there'll ever be a poll to judge all of that or a method of judging it, but I think if you consider that he'd never put a foot wrong, that he never let her down, he never got caught disagreeing with something that she felt strongly about. His behaviour was impeccable. He set a standard of courtesy and manners and humour that has never been followed by anybody else. And I think he was perfect.
We instinctively agreed on our approaches to the roles. I think that's what makes us such good friends. We agree that it's essentially a non-speaking role, and that's for two reasons, really. Firstly, you're not elected, you're not a professional politician. I don't think that gives you the right to pontificate on anything, really. And also, everything you say, everything you do, can be embarrassing potentially to your spouse. The first time that Margaret and Denis came to party conference when William was leader, we greeted them in the lobby of the hotel, and I was standing behind with Denis, as you do, and we stopped to talk to somebody in the crowd. The next thing we knew, the police cordon had closed around Margaret and William, and they were off to the next engagement. And it's not an easy thing for an 80-year-old or even a 30-year-old in high heels to sprint. But sprint we did, because nobody waits for you. And we caught up with them just as they were going into the next engagement and did the two-step behind thing perfectly, but it was very funny. Total beginner. There's a huge privilege to being involved in the centre of politics in that way. You meet some fascinating people. You get to see behind the scenes. It's interesting, it's challenging, all of that. The downside, I suppose, is to do with it being a non-speaking role. You can't answer back. You're interpreted through the things that you do. And you have to be always, always vigilant, not to be part of a problem for your spouse, which is what we all try and do. But Denis is the master. He is so dignified in the way that he carried that role, so strong in his support of Margaret, and he has never seemed diminished by that role at all. He had his own persona, and he's truly loved for it. Even now, if I'm giving a speech for one of my charities or I'm attending a business event and William comes with me, he says, "Oh, I'm doing my Denis tonight."